Okay, welcome back guys. So to our viewers, we are now finally back in studios. It's been basically about a month since we were in the lockdown, and we have been following up our content with Zoom videos, but here we are right now back live and in person. So for today's topic, we're going to talk about anger, specifically the philosophy or the value of anger, and just to bring our viewers up to date, right? So the reason why I felt this was an appropriate topic to bring up was actually in our coffee break session, right? So if viewers haven't listened to that, feel free to listen to that, where we actually brought up the issue of Greta Thunberg. We were talking about famous people, and the three of us had an interesting conversation about her display of anger, whether it's motivating, and also how at the same time it can be a turn-off. And I feel that, like, especially given where we are right now, especially with all these very tense conflicts about COVID-19, about climate change, but also at the same time, I think on a personal level, we can also talk a little bit about how we deal with anger, how we react to anger. So, so I really hope this topic for us and for our viewers, it's going to be both educational, but at the same time, we want to be honest, right, about who we are, our vulnerabilities and emotional selves. So just to bring it to a local context, I feel that in Singapore right now, there's been a lot of uproar, especially from the racial minorities, right, about racism, and obviously we've seen a few incidents of that. I think also among the working class, they've been upset about social inequality. And actually, I even would say among the political elites, maybe from the government, although they can't display they can't be too open about their anger, but sometimes it's kind of embedded in their comments, maybe in certain things that they say. Perhaps they're not happy with how they've been accused of not doing a good job when it comes to managing COVID-19. So in any case, yes, I think no matter what, we are living in a society that there are pockets of people with issues to flesh out, and we have to deal with this idea of communication and dealing with our anger. Philosophically, for today, right, we basically have two camps. So we got one camp that actually opposes anger, and this camp finds that anger is very counterproductive. It's especially in certain traditions like Buddhism or Stoicism, which I will elaborate later, they feel that anger is an unhealthy emotion. And essentially, their argument is that we should learn how to not and be embroiled in displays of anger and to act out in an angry manner. But on the other camp, so you can call it the pro-anger side, they do think that anger is a natural and appropriate response, and there is value both in our private lives but also publicly. So in any case, what I want to do first is, before I go into the anti-anger side, and then I go to the pro-anger side, and then we have a conclusion, let's talk a bit about ourselves. So I'll go first, then it sets you up for you guys to share about your own personal history of anger. So I thought of it this way. I look at three different layers. So interestingly enough, the first one is something that a lot of the literature doesn't cover, which is angry at yourself, anger at your own self. And actually, I would say, for me personally, that's something I deal with a lot. I think I'm always angry about how I don't meet up to my own standards, or I feel incompetent or mediocre. And to share a really personal experience, once I was in this handstand training camp, and I was the worst student there. I mean, I made the eligibility criteria to get there, but everyone there was a professional handstand balancer, and I was the worst. And at one point, I got so flustered with myself, I left the session and had to cry and to call my then girlfriend and vent out that I just feel so hopeless, and I was really flustered. So that's one instance. So that's one layer. The second layer I have is my own friends and family. So again, using a family example, and I'll be personal about this. So like there was one point with my elder sister, I was so angry with her, I didn't talk to her for years. So she didn't live with us, but she would live in a nearby condo, and when she made a visit to my parents' household, because of a certain incident, which I'll share later, I got really angry with her. I felt she was not being a good sister to me, and for many years I didn't talk to her. Yeah, and she could tell, and then my parents were very upset, but I kept to it, and I felt like I had to show her that I wasn't happy with what she did. So that's the second layer. Then of course the third layer is being angry at institutions, being angry at maybe people in general, because I feel that there's this complacency and nonchalantness about climate change or about social injustice. So there's also a bit of anger there, but obviously it's a lot more, not something I can direct and express in a very direct manner. So that's sort of my experience. So I look at the two of you. You two look like the finest gentlemen on earth. So let me hear a little bit from you guys about where you have been angry before, or maybe the most recent incident that you've been angry at.
Yeah, actually, a lot of people think, I am not an angry person, peaceful on the outside, but actually all my life I have dealt with anger. I remember, there was one time when I was 9 years old. I got so angry that I actually kicked glass pane in one of my bedroom doors and broke the glass, and but I think in 2017 there was actually a defining moment for me when I had a fight with my mom and my brother. And usually when you're in a fit of anger, you say things that you wish you hadn't said. And for 1 week after that, our relationship was strained, and we were barely talking to each other. And eventually, I went back to, I apologized to my mom. There was one day when I actually walked over to her house and it was raining, and I was walking in the rain.
Wow.
So
melodramatic.
It's quite dramatic, and I got there and I just apologized to her. But because of that incident, I actually made a commitment to find out more about how I can channel or handle anger. So I looked up, there's this American Buddhist nun named Pema Chodron, and she's quite well known. I mean, a lot of people read her books, and she has this audio book of a workshop recording that about anger that it's called Don't Bite the Hook. Right. And she compares anger to an addiction. So when you feel anger coming up in you, it's almost like you're a fish biting that hook, and once you bite, you can't let go. And that's what, and so I was listening to this and it really resonated with me. I'll go into it a little bit more detail later, but the whole set of teachings was based on this Buddhist teacher called Shantideva, who lived in the 8th century, I think in India. And I found it was very profound. So on the one hand, it was bad that there was this angry incident, but on the other hand, without it, it wouldn't have catalyzed me to go on this sort of quest to understand anger. And I would say until now, anger is a practice that I work with. So,
Santosh.
Yeah, I think my teens were a great phase, a phase with a lot of anger, and then my 20s, as well as my first job in a big organization that was filled with a lot of anger. For me, I was also in the phase where I was learning spiritual concepts like don't show anger and all. And there was once a mentor told me, anger is one of the defilements. You have a defilement in your mind, and so you got to fix that. So I feel there needs to be a balance between not expressing anger and also stuffing it down, and transmuting it in a healthy manner or channeling it for a healthy purpose. So I think there's an art to being observant, and channeling that energy, because anger is an emotion, and like any other emotion, it's an energy in motion. Anger, emotion, energy in motion. And if I were to just declutch the story of anger from the energy in motion and feel the somatics of the energy around it, I'll be able to better harness it and playfully live with it. Whereas what I felt happened in my 20s and my teens was that I had a very negative relationship with anger, and I didn't learn how to relate to it in a healthy manner. So I was suppressing it, and I felt a lot of shame with regards to my either expressions or outbursts of anger, or my stuffing down of anger and not expressing what was the underlying unmet need behind the anger. So that was a very tumultuous period, like my teens and my 20s, and only now I'm only able to look at it with a bit more maturity, and be a bit more playful with it, and to have a new relationship with anger.
Right. Right. So I have to say, I came in sort of, I came in thinking for sure I'm going to see the two of you being kind of like anti-anger, and I'm going to be, well, it's not fair to necessarily characterize that you guys are anti-anger and I'm pro-anger, but it's just more like I think that clearly the two of you have this spiritual and very deep practice with trying to manage anger, and I can't say I've necessarily, come up with that kind of practice myself. So when I went into researching on this topic, I felt that like what I want to get at today, by the end of today, not just from the two of you to share your own ways of dealing with anger, but also I'm sort of giving the conclusion away, which is let's look at anger not as a blanket term, but to understand its varieties and its complexity. Because I think even this dichotomy of like pro-anger, anti-anger, I feel is too simplified. Yeah, and anger actually can be very potent. Yeah, at the same time, it can be pretty toxic. But you can say that about any emotion essentially. So maybe let me just go through a little bit, because you guys actually brought in a bit of stuff already about where you obtain that knowledge about how to deal with anger, right? So in philosophy, when it comes to the topic of anger, everyone traces back to Aristotle, who came up with a very succinct definition of anger. And what he says is that anger should be treated as a response to a significant damage to something or something that you care about and you believe to be wrongfully inflicted, right? And the second condition that he says is that because it's painful, you hope for a payback. Yeah, and a very interesting thing that he points out is that if you don't want payback, right, then he doesn't consider it anger. He may consider it like grief or something. And more importantly also, when it comes to payback, it doesn't have to be personally you enacting revenge. So if someone wrongs you, for example, maybe you want that person to be caught by the law, or you want some divine justice. So a good example is that maybe if you've been divorced and you want your other partner to have a bad second marriage, so like you can have feelings like that, right? You're still angry at your ex-partner, you want the person to still suffer, even if you are not going to do any of the actual actions to inflict wrongdoing. Then we got Seneca from Stoicism, and so this one is quite a important quote that goes around in Stoicism, so I better read it out. So Seneca says, "Anger is a short madness, for it's equally devout of self-control, regardless of decorum, forgetful of kinship, obstinately engrossed in whatever it begins to do, deaf to reason and advice, excited by trifling causes, awkward at perceiving what is true and just, and like a falling rock which breaks itself to pieces upon the very thing which it crushes." So for Seneca, the two ways he looks at it, again, same thing as Aristotle. It's a response to a wrongdoing. But the other thing also for Seneca is that he says that anger is acceptable if it's in moderation. Let me clarify that. He doesn't think it's anger if you do not respond in moderation. Like it's anger is really like, actually, as you say, Unsu, it takes over you. It makes you feel like you are blocked to finding peaceful solutions, and you overreact, right, to many things around you. So basically, when it comes to Stoicism, and I think both of you are going to find a lot of resonance with this, how they feel we should treat the issue of anger is that we should be like, essentially like the Dalai Lama, right? Sure, we can protest, we can voice our disagreements, but essentially we must do it with compassion towards the people that perpetuate the violence and may even be part of that, say, system of racism, for example. But here's the important point that I want us to talk about later, which is in Stoicism, they always view these agents as not being responsible for the ignorance or for the misdeeds that they do. That's the way Stoicism looks at them, because they treat it that when people do bad things, it's due to willful ignorance. And so I would like us to talk about that later as a question. So in any case, just to sum up the part about Stoicism, so they recognize that, fine, when it comes to anger, we're not talking about suppressing it, because it's a caricature of Stoicism. It's like you don't express your emotion. It's not about that for Stoicism. It's more like you negotiate with it. And when it comes to anger, as I mentioned earlier in the intro, they see it as a healthy emotion because it conflicts with reason. And something that's in conflict with reason does not allow us to, make peace with others and to build something more, to find a peace-seeking solution. And theoretically to them, an emotion is not just a raw instinct. Emotion is actually a concept that comes with cognitive information. So think of it this way, right? Like you and I may see something happening on the streets, and perhaps you may react with anger, and I may not react with anger, even though we see the same incident. And that's because the way you interpret it is different from mine. And so that interpretation does matter when it comes to our emotions. It's still cognitive information that you make sense of before you react, right? So in any case, that's where Stoicism is. There is another person I'd like to bring in later, that's Martha Nussbaum. But let's talk about what I just mentioned just now. So do you guys find that like a very comfortable interpretation of it? Like, do you think that's essentially how you view anger? Like it's just simply about a unhealthy emotion, and further the point that I made earlier about when you see someone being angry or reacting with anger, it's because they are not acting with reason.
I think it's I would avoid like any like absolute universal statements. My first reaction to someone who is angry, hopefully, would be just curiosity, like what is really, driving them to be angry. I do find in myself, like subjectively, when I am angry, it is kind of like what the Stoics, say. It's like this fit of madness takes over you. So I have to admit that I do view anger inside myself as something that is a little irrational. But at the same time, I'm also learning to accept all emotions. So, if anger arises in me, I do try to look at it like the weather, there's a thunderstorm,
right?
Right? I mean, there's nothing to do about it. You just have to let it pass, right? And I think we have a tendency to make things worse by dwelling on things and flogging ourselves for it. Right. So, it's bad enough to be angry. Then it's like I compound that by being upset with myself about being angry. So that's part of my lifelong practice with anger. It's like, once in a while you are gonna lose it, and maybe because you're tired or whatever. There's so many different factors, and to regard oneself with self-empathy, I think, is an important skill in those situations.
Yeah, no, I think I like what you mentioned about it's the aftermath of anger with which I deal with very painful feelings of shame and guilt that is more uncomfortable and more difficult than the expression of anger in itself. And there's like a four phases of anger. There is first the build-up. And the build-up can come from a source that is not linked to the trigger or the spark, which is the second phase. There's a spark. And then after the spark, then you have the explosion of anger. And after the explosion of anger, there is the aftermath of anger, which is shame and guilt. Oh no, what did I do? I did something wrong, and then I flogged myself, And so I think it's important to like decouple and analyze it, right? And I love the pre-first phase, which is perception, the lens of perception. And there's this saying, we do not see things as they truly or they really are. We see things as we are. And this is exactly what the Buddha said, like we don't see things as the way they are, and we react to our own perceptions of things. So I think there is this whole idea of lens of perception that needs to be examined as well. But I feel something else that needs to be worked on is the build-up. The build-up is actually the fuel of unexpressed anger that we've accumulated in our entire lives that didn't have an outlet for release, for healthy release, I would say. And I think it's important to examine that and to transmute that build-up, and to reduce the fuel so that a little bit of a spark from an event or another person would not light the fuel of anger which leads to the outburst. So I think it needs to be examined across like multiple lenses, and having a very shameful, you should not feel angry, communicates underneath that a subtext of disorder, yeah, or you should not. When I feel it should be looked at very neutrally, like from a very impartial and neutral lens, from a lens of energy and how energy flows through the system. And the more we are accepting of anger, the more anger is allowed to flow freely and to do what it was supposed to do. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of context and a lot of there's quite a lot of depth to the whole idea of anger. A friend of mine, he's an expert in social emotional learning, SEL, and he says the reason why we're seeing a lot of kids who are angry is because of unmet and unarticulated needs, and this emotional and social needs, and because they don't have these needs met either in their homes or in their early childhood experiences or in their community, they come to school and they just get angry because these needs are not met. Yeah, so I think we need to look at it like not only just from like Stoicism or Aristotle, but also from like what modern science says about anger, social emotional learning, for example, what the Buddha said about anger, and the whole idea of this build-up and how do we transmute it before the spark comes. Yeah, so I think there's a lot to study and unpack.
Yeah, so actually when it comes to the modern science literature, I was actually also in my intro I wanted to mention I brought in quite a number of authors into my presentation, so I'll cite names later. But in any case, what I wanted to say was about the build-up, right? Yeah, and about how, I guess when it comes to anger, has what happened very recently in Singapore with a murder case in a school, that caught everyone, what do you call it? Like, everyone was really, really alerted to and frightened, right, by that incident. And now we are racking our brains about, what kind of mental health support we should give our students, right? So I think that is the juncture that we don't want to get to, right? Where someone commits a heinous act, and it's hard, right? Because at the same time, we don't want to defend it. No way anyone want to defend that. But the idea is that we want to understand also why it happens, and so we need to actually have measures in place to prevent from that ever happening, right? So, and that needs institutional support. Yeah. But before I get into talking about the social stuff, because that's where Martha Nussbaum comes in, I actually want to talk a little bit about why I had problems with the Stoic definition. So now I can be a little bit more open about my past as well. So when I was angry with myself, I actually engaged in self-harm. And when it happened, right, I mean, it happened a few times. I got very comfortable with doing it. I knew what I was doing, rationally I knew what I was doing. And I also knew that, like, okay, I don't deserve to do it to myself, but I needed that release. It was kind of like, it's not a catalyst, but it's a, it's like you got some pressure valve in you, right? And you felt like, okay, I need to unleash this anger and I don't want to do it to someone else, so why don't I do it to myself? So that's one way I kind of work with it. So obviously not advisable to our audiences to do this, but just to say honestly and authentically, yeah, I think that's what self-anger can lead to. And the other thing I was going to mention was about my sister, right? So just to give a little bit more details, what happened was my then ex-wife, so we were together and we adopted a cat into my parents' house. Now, to be fair, I didn't ask my mom for permission. So when she came home, she was like, "What's the cat doing in the house?" And she ran to my sister. And then my sister messaged me and she was really angry with me, right? She's like, what are you doing? You're being very disrespectful, blah, blah, blah. Now, look, I don't need my sister to take my side. Obviously, I understand that I really wasn't being fair to my mom. Should have asked her for permission. I thought that she might see the cat and fall in love with it. Turned out she didn't. But what I was angry about was that my sister didn't try to reach out to me in a amicable manner and say, "Hey, bro, what were you thinking? Maybe you shouldn't have done this. Just please be considerate. I know the cat is not a big deal, but mom really doesn't want this in the house." So this is what I wanted from her, and that's what I was angry about. And going back to build up, it wasn't just because of this incident, because I always felt that in my whole life, my sister has never looked up to me. She's always treated me like a child. She's always felt like, oh, I'm just that nerdy kid playing video games. I don't know anything about the world. So I knew that this was her display of like superiority over me. And that's why I did the whole cold shoulder treatment for 2 years or more. And look, I'm not ashamed to say it. Obviously, I'm saying it right now. And that's why I had a problem with the Stoic definition. I wasn't looking for payback on her. I still want her to be part of the family. I still want her to see my parents, but I need to show her that there has been some injustice I feel you've committed to me as an individual. And I'm not looking for any revenge or anything, just for you to know that. And maybe just for her to apologize and just come up to me one day and say, I'm sorry, did I say something wrong? Why are you treating me like this? Can we be brother and sister again? But she never ever did that. Of course, now things are a lot better. Of course, years have passed, but I guess my point is that I couldn't really agree with this definition, even from Seneca or Aristotle, that the victims of say injustice or of a certain incident who feel angry about something, they don't always look for a payback. Like they just need to sometimes be angry and to express what they feel has been a violation, say, of their dignity or of their sense of self. So yeah. Do you have any comments about what I said?
I actually like, this is something I read in a book called Language of Emotions by Karla, McLaren. I think I may have mentioned it before in one of our chats, but she talks about how all of us have boundaries, and you can even imagine like an energy field around you that's your boundary, but there are also other kinds of boundaries, social boundaries. And anger arises when your boundary has been compromised, right? When someone has done harm to you or attacked you or invaded your space. And anger is kind of like your sentry. It's like the soldier at the castle wall that is guarding your boundary. And that is a positive sort of aspect of anger. But when you start using anger to attack someone else's boundary, that's where it leads into this endless cycle of vengeance, right? And I think that's why we try to caution against anger, because I think deep down inside we know that it just leads to another cycle of anger and violence. Anyway, that's how I look at anger.
Yeah. No, I think I like the example that you brought up. And first and foremost, I would like to thank you for modeling vulnerability. I think that's very, very important that we model vulnerability and we express our stories and our experiences authentically. And so appreciate that so much, because we then by giving ourselves the permission to share our own individual experiences, we give others the permission to do so. And I like what you mentioned about your story, and I think underlying that there is something called unresolved conflict, either within myself or with someone else. And I think in our society, we don't have the tools or the instruments or the language to talk about conflict in a healthy manner. So in our attempts to avoid conflict, there's this whole term called conflict avoidance, because we don't know how to deal with it. We rather avoid it and we sweep it under the carpet, and then it's left to fester for a very long time until it blows up. Rather than dealing with it head on with tools like nonviolent communication, the language of emotions, I think what we need to do is to build the capacity and the capability for dealing with conflicts. So my boundaries has been transgressed, and my request to you is this, because I have an unmet need, which is this. Like, just communicating things like that actually helps the other party and myself understand a bit more about like what are the unmet needs and what are the unresolved conflicts. And I see that a lot in our nation, in Singapore, because the role models that we had of leaders, I think a lot of that exhibited anger. And so internally, while we were growing up, I think a lot of us thought that anger was healthy. Yeah, so I think I think for me, I looked up to leaders who were domineering, who exerted the force of will to do something, and I think we paid too much reverence to them, what we should have actually, but what we didn't realize that in their attempts to exert dominance or control over people, people felt that their boundaries were transgressed, and a lot of this were swept under the carpet. And then we have this whole idea of artificial harmony, which is not real harmony. It's not real authentic harmony. It's only in the conflicts where we grow closer together. And this is why, I mean, based on the conversations I've run nationally on issues like gender inequality or low-income communities, or even race and racism, and now right now on interfaith dialogues, we don't have the tools to just communicate and have healthy conflict to begin with. And that's why we have so much of suppressed, bottled up anger in our society.
Okay, so Santosh, I'm glad that you brought this up because this segues into Martin Nussbaum's argument about anger, because now we're getting to the social-political level layer. So again, we're still, just for our viewers to know, we're still on the anti-anger camp, so I'm still within that framework. So Martin Nussbaum, she's a very notable philosopher, just for our viewers to know. So she feels that, you know, because anger is very what she considered a primitive emotion that amplifies our worst tendencies, jeopardizes tolerance. So she finds it like it's culpable, like the anger is a culpable agent in promoting terrorist ideology, mass violence, what else? So I'm just reading out from my notes. She says that it causes out to shut out dissent, take pleasure in inflicting pain on others, transforms other people's suffering into something that we take to be right and warranted. So essentially, she also thinks that anger also can lead to us projecting our hateful emotions on the wrong individuals, so that could happen as well, and it undermines our ability to have reasonable judgments. And of course, in that sense, then it's very counterproductive in politics, and it could lead to irrevocable conflict and violence. So going back to what you said, Santosh, right? So I want to go back to the key word that you use, unmet needs, right? So let's have this realistic scenario in place. We are now in this public space right now, and this freedom actually to talk about racism, right? But we have essentially two opposing groups. We have one group who feel oppressed, legitimately or not, and then we got another group that says you are not oppressed, right? And both sides are angry at each other. And so we are now at this juncture where we have to mediate and decide, okay, whose unmet needs should we accommodate to? Because you got one camp that obviously would say, and this actually comes to the later second part of the pro-anger side, right? We have one camp that you could argue is gaslighting the other and saying that it's not injustice what's happening to you, your anger is not legitimate. So what do you feel? Like, how do we deal with, conflicts of two camps not having the same interpretation of unmet needs, or what kind of needs to be met up to?
Yeah, no, I think we can talk about two things, hurts and harms on one hand, and then unmet needs. Yeah, and when people come to the table and have an open discussion on where have I felt hurt or harmed, and what are my unmet needs, and we go around and have a candid discussion around that, therein surfaces the collective harms and hurts that we've caused, and then we can then move on to the next phase, which is healing and reconciliation. So I think having open conversations on hurts and harms, which is subjective, I'll agree subjective, but just having open conversations on both the part of the oppressor, perceived oppressor, and the oppressed, that both have experienced hurt and harms. I think just acknowledging that is half the battle won. Like, I acknowledge I don't want to gaslight you by minimizing the hurts and harms you felt. So I think that's one thing that we need to have conversations on, and then go through mediation, conflict resolution, and then and so on, right? And then there will be harmony. And then the other one is unmet needs, and we all have different needs because not all of us have all our developmental needs met from young. You see, we live in a very unequal society, and in a community, it is normal that some people have more of their unmet needs, more unmet needs than others. And just openly communicating that and having the space to, psychological safe space to acknowledge this inequality in unmet needs is also a great start. Yeah, and then how can we now come together to meet individual needs and the collective needs as well? Yeah, so that's what I feel, what I want to see in our society when we're talking about issues of like racism or gender inequality, or even like cancel culture, or
we'll probably go into that later as well.
Yeah, so that's my very simple like framework. Like, there are harms and hurts which have to be acknowledged, and needs.
I like the framework of needs. Recently I've been following this framework called nonviolent communication that was developed by Marshall Rosenberg, and highly recommend people look it up. But like a very simple example of how this can be used to resolve, let's say, seemingly intractable conflicts. There's a story or an example of a group of Greenpeace activists that went to this town in Japan and approached this mayor and said, you have to stop this like dolphin hunting or overfishing or something. I can't remember the specific issue. And they just got into this heated argument. Like the mayor was just like, this is a tradition that my people have been engaged in for centuries, and like what's going to happen, right? And so then this nonviolent communication or NVC practitioner was brought in to help mediate, and he just listened to the mayor. And there's a process that an NVC practitioner goes through when you're listening to someone. You're trying to extract the needs out of what they're saying. They could be very emotional or whatever, and you just slowly try and dig deep, and then you reflect back to them. And so, he started reflecting back to the mayor, I really understand that you really care about the livelihoods of your fishermen, and you're worried what's going to happen if they have to stop this practice overnight. And he said, we are concerned about the same thing too, because if the overfishing continues, there'll be no more fish left. And then what are they going to do, And then so all of a sudden there was this moment of clarity where the mayor realized, actually, the needs are the same. The underlying needs are the same. It's just that the strategies that you're using to meet those needs can be different. So the conflict happens at the level of the strategies. And once you recognize that, you can then, as a group, agree, okay, let's explore different strategies where we can meet all of our needs collectively. So the whole idea is to acknowledge everyone's needs, put it all on the table, and then try and figure out, okay, what is the way that we can meet the most number of needs at the lowest cost? And that is, I think, something that we can collectively do.
Yeah, I have to say, as idyllic and as beautiful as that sounds, like I do think that's probably also why we are fighting so many different types of crises, right? Because we don't actually have that kind of institutional platform to have huge groups and literally industries. You need perhaps, and I'm using a real example, right? Let's say if you want to deal with climate change, well, you need to have the fossil fuel industry on one side, and then you have maybe the citizens of the country actually having a cross dialogue, right? And actually discussing what do you need, right? And what do we need, right? In order to overcome this impasse when it comes to climate change. And I think for me, one of the issues I had, going back to what I said about Stoicism, was when they consider that people commit harmful acts due to willful ignorance. Sometimes I don't think it's ignorance. I think people are quite aware of what's happening and what they're doing. But I do think that they do perceive it as my self-interest to continue perpetuating it. And as much as I would like that framework to work, I don't think it's always going to work maybe all the time, But anyway, perhaps let me go on to what the other camp is saying, and maybe we can try to work out the kinks around this. So going back to Martha Nussbaum, so she actually also advances the argument in another way as well. So despite recognizing the negative effects of anger, she does propose that what we can do is transform this into something that she calls transitional anger. So what is transitional anger? Basically, it's the idea that instead of always thinking about having payback, right, which is one of the conditions about anger, right, we actually think about clearing our heads, spending some time conducting and she uses Nelson Mandela as an example, conversations with myself. So the idea is that if we make conversations with ourselves, we can maybe see that the arguments that we produce out of anger, actually maybe they're very weak or flimsy, but really at the end of the day, what we want to do is exude a voice of forward-looking reason and some kind of optimistic future. So in any sense, she does talk about how transitional anger does require a lot of moral, political effort, and cooperation, self-examination. And I got a really cool example from Nelson Mandela here. So Nelson Mandela, when he was 27 years in prison, right? It's said, it's not really confirmed, but it's said that he had the book Meditations by the Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius. And so when he came out of prison and was continuing his fight against apartheid, there was a moment where the African National Congress wanted to decertify the rugby team because its connections to racism. but he went the other direction. So he actually backed the team, right, to a World Cup victory. He got the white players to teach black children. And so when people were charging him and accusing him of, like, you're being too good to people, or you're willing to see too much goodness in people, he said that your duty is to work with human beings as human beings, and not because you think they are angels. So essentially, to go back to the idea about payback, right? So he was, rejecting that, rejecting having an obsession with trying to, find justice with white Africans, and even another very personal deed that he performed was when he was in prison and he had to wash dishes. Well, he didn't need to wash dishes. Sorry, there was a warden who was washing dishes, and he volunteered to wash the dishes with the warden. So that really showed the humility that he had, and so that's how he overcame anger. So in any case, right, according to Martha, she is, on the other hand, realistic that Nelson Mandela obviously did commit acts of violence. So it's not that you don't commit such acts, right? And in some sense, it can be justifiable. Perhaps there is a need to express their anger, but there's always some kind of strategic vision for where you're going in the future, and in that sense, that's why it's transitional, because in the end, that anger should lead to something good. So any comments first? Yeah, anything? What do you feel about it?
Yeah, no, I think, so there's this saying, right? The lack of forgiveness is like drinking poison, thinking the other person is going to get hurt from, your unforgiveness. So I think a huge part of work on anger is, I love the word you used at the initial part of our conversation, compassion. Compassion, inquiry into myself and into the other person's feelings and emotions and what led them to their outbursts of anger. And then I think what Unsu mentioned about NVC is so powerful. I think it's still incomplete in my personal opinion. Like when I go deep into this and when I'm practicing NVC, I realize it's more than just that, and I'm trying to bring in fields of knowledge around authentic relating. I think I didn't learn how to relate authentically with other people from young. I didn't know how to tune into my body somatically and understand, okay, I'm feeling a little suffocated now. My boundaries are being transgressed. Just verbalizing what I'm feeling right now before anger happens. So I think I'm doing a lot of unlearning or maybe relearning of just expressing what's going on in my body first. Oh, I'm feeling discomfort here, something, I wanted to tell you something, just expressing feelings and emotions as they are. So that's one very important part of the work, which is somatic awareness and awareness of feelings. The other one is attunement. When I'm starting to talk to someone else, I notice when people start to talk across one another, that's where attunement has not been established. There is a lack of connection, and so while there are exchange of words, there is no connection. There's no attunement, and attunement is a very fine, subtle experience when I know how you feel. I can empathize and I can relate to that, and you can also do that. And when that has been established, then there is a deep level of trust for healing and reconciliation to take place. There are two other things that I learned along the way. One is self-regulation. I didn't know how to regulate my nervous system. So I would get into a fit of anger or react so quickly rather than respond. Yeah, so learning how to self-regulate through my breath, and it's said again through ancient science and wisdom that anger is accompanied by breath that is shallow and very rapid. And you can use your breath to transmute that rather than telling yourself, don't be angry, Santosh. Actually, that resistance to anger makes anger become bigger, whereas the acceptance of anger and breathing, self-regulation, that helps. Now, the other one is co-regulating as well, because we also want to help the other person regulate before we get into a discussion. So there are all these subtle nuances to relating authentically that I never learned, that I was developmentally so deprived when I was growing up.
So just to catch you on one particular note, one particular point you mentioned, right? So you're also saying essentially that you also don't think it's healthy to suppress anger, that it does require some kind of healthy outlet. Is that right? Is that the reaction?
And I don't know. What I'm learning is how to self-regulate. I don't think I learned how to self-soothe. Like never when I was young, I had healthy models of adults probably who learned how to self-soothe themselves. Like a lot of the adults I looked up to just they just express anger very easily. Yeah, it's only like later on when I learned breathing techniques where I learned what is the meaning behind self-soothing. Like I can self-soothe myself. I never knew that I could give myself that permission.
Actually, I got one tip. It's going to sound really odd, but I think I use it for myself, which is I just look at cute dog and cat pictures and videos. Yeah, because honestly, it does work. Yeah, because if you just kind of take your mind off things and you just look at something cute for a little while, even though it's very distracting, but it just kind of like, oh, you're like, oh, so cute, you know, like, and then you just kind of lose the initial feeling of feeling angry. What about you?
I have another tip. There was one time my wife and I were really upset with each other, and as an experiment, we just decided to just do this.
Oh, really?
Like you try and do this, and we'll look at each other and it's like, yeah, it's really hard to be angry with each other when you're doing something really silly. So.
No, actually, that's a very good point you brought up. It's preempting already, like somewhere towards the end of my presentation of my notes, that humor actually is a very useful mechanism for diffusing anger. Yeah, so that's something that's really been found. So I wanted to say something about the transitional anger thing. Okay, so let me put it this way. Yeah, now I remember what I was going to say. So I think it's a very beautiful concept, and I think essentially, yes, I would think that fundamentally at the end of the day, you don't want to just let that anger be utilized to even more nefarious ends or to a worse outcome, right? Because even if, like, we're talking on a social political level, if you're seeking justice, you know, let's make that anger constructive and let's make sure it gets us to a better place at the end of the day. But I do think that, like what Nelson Mandela was used as an example, I mean, the guy is not flawless. He has engaged in acts of violence, and I do think that I'm not being myself not a scholar, so I'm not adjudicating whether it was right or wrong, but just saying that I think in human history, sometimes that act of violence sometimes necessitates or actually brings about a new understanding about what is so wrong with the current system. I mean, there were a lot of white Africans obviously that were very comfortable with apartheid. They had no problems with just keeping the system. And you do need sometimes to show how grave and unjust it is. And sure, I mean, whether right or wrong, perhaps that required that kind of expression of anger. So that's what I think. Okay, do you want me to go on to the next one? Shall I go? Yeah. Okay, so I think this is where things are going to get very interesting, because this is actually one of the most most forceful opponents actually to Martha Nussbaum. So her name is Amia Srinivasan. She's actually a British philosopher. So she's written quite a couple of essays on anger, and yes, she's essentially like the pro-anger side. So what she finds problematic about Martha and Stoicism and Aristotle's way of conceptualizing anger is that it's about let me just get this right. So it's not just about the system for Amaya. She also feels that it's also about the individuals that are committing or perpetuating the injustice. So in her language, it's the misogynist, the racist, or maybe even the rich, right? So in her case, what she actually wants to address is that we don't expect the racists to undo the fact of racism, but I'm quoting her here, when a woman is raped, is there not some insult to her dignity, some violation of her standing as a human being that must be undone? Does gender justice not demand that men lose their privilege, and racial justice that white people lose theirs? So what she's trying to say is that when you have two groups of people, and we were talking about oppressed people and the oppressors, just because when the oppressed try to reclaim some rights and equality for themselves, and hence form a new level of equality, that is not inhumane violence that's committed to the oppressors, right? So just to make it very clear, she says it's misleading to suggest that one type of inequality is equal to the other type of inequality, as if women, or if white people start to take back some of their rights, that is a new form of inequality that the other camp deserves to be angry about. So what she's trying to say is that anger is really essential to reclaiming one's sense of self-worth, and in doing so, you may have to loosen the grip of the other other camp, right? So the other way that another writer also talk about, his name is Brian Wong, he's an Oxford scholar. So he also thinks that anger can be productive epistemically. So that's the idea that, you know, we have groups of people now having this collective collective sense of anger, and we have this common understanding what we are angry about. And it helps us make sense of, you know, what is the specific features of that victimization, and we don't have to feel like we have to blame ourselves, right? And we sometimes talk about this, right, the myth of self-responsibility, because sometimes the victims are told you should blame yourself, you know, you shouldn't be angry at us, you should be angry at yourself for being poor or you know, being an ethnic minority. Yeah, as if you can blame someone for that, as if you can blame yourself for that. But yeah, but that's the idea. So again, it goes back to the idea about gaslighting. And the other important point that Brian also makes is that anger is also that potent thing that gets people to rally and organize and to form a collective. Yeah. So in the words of Amia, she feels that even though what Martha picked, in the sense of Nelson Mandela's example, she feels that that's like kind of selective bias, right? If you really do an honest appraisal of history, you would realize that actually anger is really that crucial ingredient that may have spurred a lot of social movements. So, and here's a really good example, because I also thought about this myself, right? In American history, you got Martin Luther King, and he's seen a little bit more pacifist than his actually this other partner, which is Malcolm X. Because Malcolm X was clearly a lot more visibly outraged, had a lot more stronger language, right, compared to Martin Luther King. And I think in some sense, you know, when we are in a climate where we're presented with two types of solutions, one clearly looks going to be quite violent, and Malcolm X said, you know, by any means necessary to reclaim back black equality. And then you got Martin Luther King that was really good to go the other way. But nevertheless, Martin Luther King was also just as outraged and angry as well. He just wanted it to be a little bit more like the transitional justice approach. I think that's why the elites or, you know, the oppressors at the time felt that, okay, if I had to pick one or the other, I'd rather go with Martin Luther King. I'd rather pick that side. But you needed that other, you needed the Malcolm X, you needed that particular person to show, if you're not going to pick this route, we're going to go a lot more harder on you. So that's kind of like how Amia, you know, conceives of like why this kind of anger is also important. So yeah, so just to sum it up, she thinks that, you know, like if we don't, you know, equip and we don't utilize the weapon of anger, then it's very hard to make sense of like all the various injustices in the world, whether it's the Palestinians, the feminists, the BLM protesters, because she wants us to imagine if you want these social movements to be effective, right, and they were not allowed to express anger, how successful would they really have been? Yeah, and so so she just wants us to be reminded that anger, as much as it can be counterproductive, yeah, but it's an essential feature of political life, and she's worried that people like Nussbaum, by trying to wash away anger, you are compounding the very injustice that you say you care about. So that's a takeaway, that's a conclusion. So what do you make of it? I think it's very deep, thought-provoking.
It's definitely very thought-provoking.
Yeah.
You know, I think this is a very complex discussion because we're talking about anger on so many different levels, like personal, social, political, and we're trying to say, you know, is there any value to anger? So even on a personal level, like you were saying, in an example of a woman who gets raped, like anger might have value or useful in terms of restoring some balance or some aspect of her dignity. And yeah, I can see that. I think, you know, we're still at the dawn of understanding this whole complex that, you know, of anger, and we really have to approach it like scientists, you know, like, and that's how I approach anger in my own life. Like, there are certain practices, you try it, does it work, does it not? You know, like in your case, you were saying, yeah, NVC, there's definitely, you know, bits missing from that framework, and I agree, you know, like, and that's why I think of anger as a lifelong practice, because I will, you know, get to a point where, oh wow, there's something missing, and then I need to find some other somatic practice that supports that. In the case of social movements, I feel that we might we might be being drawn into a false kind of debate where we're trying to say, is anger good or bad, right? Because in a way, like using my earlier metaphor of anger as like the weather, it just happens. We don't say, is the thunderstorm good or bad? It's a fact. But then, what do you do with that? You know, do you take shelter? Do you rush out and go, like I'm in touch with the gods or whatever? There's so many different ways of responding. And I think, if Palestinians are being bombed and oppressed, I think it's human nature that they will be angry. I think that is a fact. But that doesn't mean that there might be an inspiring Palestinian leader that thinks, maybe there's a different way than just rage and anger. Maybe there's a way to open up more possibilities for the Israelis to relate to us in a different way, through art or whatever. So in a sense that I accept all these arguments, I accept, if you look at history, anger has played a big role, but it doesn't mean that moving forward, we shouldn't act like scientists and think, no, wait, maybe there's a better way. Maybe there's a next stage of human evolution where we can figure out a better way to resolve these things that doesn't just lead to another cycle of violence.
Yeah, no, I like where we're getting to. There are just a few things that came to my mind. The first thing is about privilege obliviousness. Like, I think the oppressors and those with privilege are not really conscious or aware of the privilege that they might have. And so I think having conversations around this new term that I've come across, right? And there's a cartography of privilege obliviousness. So it tells you like where are the lines of privilege, right? Men, white, wealthy, and of a certain country, and then where are the lines of less privilege? And there's a cartographical map, just to raise awareness to people from both ends that in any conversation, when you're having a conversation, there is a cartography of privilege. And there are groups that are completely oblivious to it. And so I think having means and mechanisms like art or authentic relating to address blind spots of people who are in positions of privilege is very important, because I've seen instances where elites in a particular country can make decisions on behalf of the citizens, all at the same time being disconnected with ground sentiments. So I think it's important that we have channels for communication that express ground sentiments so that leaders are accountable or are aware of privilege. Now the second thing is about this distinction between punitive justice and restorative justice, right? Yeah, so I think like a lot of our justice systems are quite archaic in that they don't heal the person who is hurting the other person, because behind every person who hurts, there is a victim crying for help. Only hurt person hurts other people, and addressing the underlying root cause of hurt is very important. And that's a very important shift from punitive justice systems to restorative forms of justice systems. Yeah, there's a beautiful, I don't know when are we concluding, but there's a beautiful African proverb. I was giving a talk and engaging a group of university students in Singapore just on this African proverb, and it's so simple but very profound. Yeah, and so it goes like this: a child who is not embraced by the village will burn down the entire village just to feel its warmth. Yeah, so it's beautiful, right? So there's the rage and the fury of burning down the village, and there's so many children who are burning down the village in this global ecosystem. Yeah, but why are we doing that? It's because we never had the warmth that we always wanted when we were growing up. Yeah, so I think essential to all of that is bringing like belonging, a sense of belonging and connectedness from the sense of disconnectedness that we have with one another. Yeah.
So before I go into that, right, because I wanted to respond to Ongsu's point, and I think actually, sorry, you did bring it up as well in the very first part of your what you were saying about privilege, right? And I think this is also another issue we need to address, right, which is take the example of the Palestinian, or take the example of, and a good example, Brett Kavanaugh, right? So just for our viewers to know, Brett Kavanaugh was this US, was supposed to be, he's already appointed Supreme Judge. But during the lead up to his trial, there was a woman called Christine Ford, who accused him of having committed something, a sexual crime in their past. And you know what, when I read feminist interpretations of that event, one of the things they pointed out was that, you know, Brett Kavanaugh was allowed, like as a white man, to be angry at the entire system, to be questioned about his integrity, whereas Christine Ford had to be composed. She had to present herself as she's a woman that's not driven by rage and anger. And you know, they always point to this kind of double standards, especially in the public sphere, where you know, someone that's on a elite status, so in this case you got a man, a white guy, but also when it comes to, say, the Palestinians, so the Palestinians are also told, you know, cool down, don't be so hot-headed, it's due to your acts of anger, that's why we are not able to have a peace deal. So I think there's this issue of like unequal access to unequal rights to expression of anger, because one camp is seen, you know, and to please the victim, is seen as unreasonable, irrational, and like as if their anger is not warranted. So I think that's the very difficult issue to tackle. So I think when we were talking about having conciliation sessions and having people meet in the middle, I think that's something that the powerful has to recognize, that you have this privileged access to be angry and to feel like as if there's no right to question them. And I think that's why I find anger such a complex issue. And going back to what you said, so it's true, like same thing that we're trying to achieve here. We're not trying to categorically denounce anger or to pronounce anger as a right, as a virtue or a vice, but we need to recognize that it's such a complex power, emotional power, that is you know, it can be weaponized in such different ways, right? So yeah. So but I want to also bring this up actually, because we talk about cancel culture, and I'd like to hear from the two of you on this. So this happened in Singapore. Are you guys familiar with the Nasi Padang case? Oh, okay.
I think I might be. Is it a chat group?
No, so this is what happened, okay? So there was a cafe, and actually, thankfully, I don't remember the name of the cafe. So in any case, this particular cafe advertised their Nasi Padang dish, and they use these words. This is our version of Nasi Padang without the nasties. So a lot of people online essentially caught on to those words without the nasties, and so they called them out and, you know, tried to have them cancelled essentially. Now look, the cafe responded, in my opinion, quite readily, immediately, you know, said that, you know, poor choice of words, we don't mean what we say, about denigrating a cultural dish, otherwise we wouldn't make it, right? So that's already one argument they had. But the other thing they pointed out was, okay, you know, look at our establishment, obviously we're very mixed, you know, there's different sort of races working here, and obviously we're very race friendly, right? So in any case, right, what I want to discuss with you guys was, now the outburst from this, in my opinion, was, even though you guys didn't hear about it, but it was really loud on social media. And I actually, you know, read a couple of critiques, and I understand where some of these critiques are coming from, because they are trying to argue that this is a colonization of traditional food, right, Malay food, and to make it sound like the original form of the food is unhealthy, it's not good for you, whereas this is the superior version, right? But I think the line was drawn when they start to really nitpick on the business and to point, like call out people specifically in the business, because I think that's where the line, the angle has been drawn to a toxic level where, you know, you have a critique going on that's fair and warranted, but perhaps way too narrow, way too disproportionate to this specific business. So, thoughts?
Yeah, I know. I think what comes to mind for me is that even if we accept that, you know, anger is justified in a lot of cases, I still feel that we should, like, and this is my personal practice as well, like practicing patience. So a lot of times I find that, like, you know, I'm angry because I'm impatient. There's some element of impatience in it. And I think with these, like with cancel culture, I think there's this phenomena of, you wake up, you see a tweet, and you're like, oh, I got to jump in. I feel about this, and you just immediately tweet back, right? And personally, that made sense. But then when you've got like 1,000, 2,000 people doing the same thing, the harm that is done to that person on the receiving end is actually quite a lot. And things would be a lot better if we just slowed everything down. If I felt I didn't have to jump on this bandwagon straight away, let's just see how things play out. But yeah, I think what happens in social media now is it's almost like this, this wildfire analogy. It's like a wildfire that just spreads so quickly.
Yeah. No, I think we have not learned how to regulate ourselves and to self-soothe ourselves, so that there's in the morning when we see a trigger like that, we just go keyboard warrior on it. And there's an army of psychologists behind these social media platforms that are designing it for us to be more divided. So in Facebook, right, engineers put up a proposal and a paper saying that social media actually, Facebook actually exploits the human brain's attraction to divisiveness. Yeah, so a lot of these social media sites, or even online sphere, is designed just to exploit that divisiveness within us. And I think what you said, right, we need to learn how to take a step back and to regulate ourselves and our emotions and our nervous systems, because we get into this fight, flight and flee, freeze and fawn, right? Yeah, and that is the sympathetic nervous system response, and we need to learn how to regulate. So I think for me, that is a symptom of something deeper, that we as kids and kids today and those who are in this generation, social media generation, they are not growing up to learn to how to regulate themselves and their nervous systems. Yeah. So I think that's essential.
So actually this dovetail with something I was going to mention about, as much as I think there's a lot of respectable ideas about how anger, is crucial, is valuable in expressing, in featuring, when things are violated, dignities have been violated and stuff like that. So on a personal level as well, going back to what you said about modern research, right? It's been found that chronic anger, so the idea that you're constantly angry, is very, very toxic. And one good example comes from people who've been divorced. There are some successful divorcees where they are amicable, they can be friendly with each other, but there are also cases where that chronic anger is still there, and they're constantly, the term is called, there's constant rehearsal of grievances. And so because of that, they can never move on, they can never really get to a better place. Incidentally, even a feminist writer, so her name is Vivian Gottnick, and she's also someone who's very expressive and vocal about anger, but even she came to a certain point in her writing where she acknowledges that her constant anger about feminist issues has also cost her or hurt her relationships, because in that sense she has displaced or projected her anger at the societal patriarchy, but it's now been projected onto her partners, and she then realized that essentially expecting perfect behavior is actually the enemy of the good, and so I think going back to what I mentioned just now, I think when there are instances where perhaps we want to be angry collectively, and I think sometimes it's a measure of it's a matter of knowing what's the right platform to talk about it. So if, for example, if someone were to write a petition, I think that's fine. I think you can still project that anger in a reasonable manner. So in that sense, that's why I disagree with the Stoic definition. I think you can be reasonable about your anger. You can definitely tone it down also to a level where it's not being too toxic in your own life, but also to the recipient, right? Because like I said, going back to the vision of what the anger is supposed to be used for, it's to bring us to a better place. You don't want to just call out someone, but then there's no improvement in that social practice. And in that sense, that's where, okay, so this is where it gets to the part about implementation. So again, going back to the two philosophers, Amia and Nussbaum. So for Amia, she feels that when we talk about, say, the failed, so all the things that we see in society that we consider are failing us, right? So how Nussbaum sees it is a failure of implementation, right? The institutions are not performing up to their expected roles. But here's where it goes back to the original equation about agents and are they actually willfully knowledgeable or ignorant about what they do. To Amia, she feels that sometimes it's not that the institutions are not performing, it's that they are in the power of the oppressors, and they're actually functioning the way they want it to function, right? So let's take something that you talk about, Santosh, the CMIO model. I mean, you could have very reasonable conversations, I guess, with government, with political leaders, but they essentially say, no, we're pretty happy to keep that, you know. So isn't there something to be said about how fundamentally, you know, anger is going to come out of this irreconcilable conflict of interest?
Yeah. For me, there is this very important thing that I've learned, like having even been in the government and the civil service, right, is that actually you feel like you're in the driver's seat and you're steering the wheel. I like the analogy Unsu uses. You think you're in control, but actually you're not in control. Like it's a whole machinery unto itself that even people who have the levers to change, they are not in control. And I think what I've come to realize is to acknowledge our humanity, that we're not in control of a lot of things. And we're not in control, in as much as we're not in control of things outside of us, we're not in control of a lot of things that happen within us. And that has given me a lot of healing. Because like in my mid to late 20s, I used to be a very angry activist, social justice warrior, only to realize that actually like a lot of these things aren't even in, like people in power don't have the levers to control, and neither do I. And why do I feel like responsible for such things? And that was my journey to like switch to a bit more, to switch to other forms of activism and social justice.
Oh, this is actually interesting to hear from you. So you disavow being a social justice warrior. The social justice warriors are going to come after you now. No, but okay, that's a good one. I wanted to also, I think it's good for our discussion. So take the term, right, social justice warrior. I mean, even to me, the connotation of the word is pretty positive sounding, right? Yeah, and it's been used as an epithet by now. And to me, it's like, although it doesn't really relate to anger in some sense, but I feel like if you own up to the word and you say, okay, fine, I'm a social justice warrior, I care about social justice and I want to be aggressive about it, but it doesn't make me irrational or angry, you know, like a constant hotbed of rage and you know being angry all the time. I'm not the hawk, right? So I don't see why can't we own the word and say, fine, we're going to be aggressive or militant or persistent, but it doesn't make us irrationally angry.
Actually, I think I read somewhere that the mature warrior in that's even a tribal society, they're actually the ones who will do everything possible to avert outright conflict. Like violence will be the last resort, and that is actually the mark of a true warrior that is looking to protect their tribe. And you know, I think again I go back to just looking at evidence, testing the experiences in your life, and just really thinking, you know, has being angry ever furthered your cause or the thing, or create an outcome that you wanted? Have you tried other methods? And yeah, you know, and the workshop that I was referring to the before, Pema Chodron, she, you know, talks about Shantideva, and he wrote this famous book that is like the foundation of a lot of like Buddhism. And the 6th chapter is all about anger and patience, right? And the opening verse of that is that he says something like, you know, 1,000 days of good works can be destroyed in a single second by a flash of anger. And that's just a stunning opening thing to that chapter, right? And it really makes you think, because I found it true to be in my life. Like I could spend 3 years building a close relationship with my mom and my brother, and in just one fit of anger, like erode all of that. And so I think if you are a social justice warrior or someone who is really wanting to do good work in this world, you should pay attention to that verse and consider the possibility that you might actually spend all your effort and all your lifetime building something good and destroy it in one fit of like irrational anger. And it's just something to be aware of.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's a very good point actually, because I think it also gels well with what I said about the Nasi Padang case, because I do think that when I saw that, even I got personally a bit turned off and felt that, okay, now it's getting a bit overboard, because you can't assume that you know what the business manager is up to, whether he's a racist, and you know, it's not that I defend what the actual act was. Actually, sorry, there's another very good example, Brownface, right? You know about that one?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So let's look at that case study, right? I mean, there was actually outright anger, right, at the produced ad. And eventually, actually this is a point up for the pro-anger side, because due to the visible displays of anger, that's why the ad got revoked, and you know, we now are a lot more cognizant and careful about producing brownface type media, right?
Remind me again, so it was an ad for, was it
Yeah, I believe it's for SMRT, right? And what happened was, this one I'm clear on, it's about them using Dennis Chu, the Chinese actor. So he actually was, you know, portraying the 4 different races. So obviously he had the brown paint on him. And you know what's the funny thing about that ad? I was actually very curious, why did people also talk about him dressing up as a Muslim woman? Because everyone was focused on the Indian character, but what about the Muslim woman actually? So even I was thinking about, why wasn't there similar outrage at that? So in any case, yeah, so that's the brownface incident. Now here's an interesting also follow-up to that. So the two artists, right, the brother and sister, Pretty Please and Subhash, they produced a music video. I assume you haven't watched it.
I've seen it.
Oh, you've seen it?
I've seen bits of it, yeah.
Okay, you've seen it, right? So again, there was anger now directed at them. And then when it came to the adjudication of the entire affair, let's take the law minister, Shanmugam. I mean, he was, you know, he recognized that yes, the ad was in poor taste, but he was also just as harsh on the brother and sister artists. And he was, you know, essentially, to me, that's what I mean by elitist anger. He was essentially angry at them. He was saying that, oh, they shouldn't have used that kind of language and all that. So again, I think this goes back to what I said earlier about unequal rights to who can display anger in a legitimate manner and be accepted. But also at the same time, going back to what you said, I don't know, man, like should Pretty Please and Subhash not have done anything? Could they have found some other way to express their outrage, and could the music video be different? Yeah, I'm a bit dumbfounded actually. What would have been a better means of course?
Maybe, you know, like this goes back to, I think, something that you've been trying to dig up about like the structural inequalities. I think anger is actually a byproduct of inequality. You know, I think when you have someone who's very, very powerful and someone who's powerless, both sides will be much more prone to anger. You know, the person who is in power feels like they are, what's the word, like, you know, they can't be touched or harmed, so they're free to do whatever, right? So they just give in to anger. Similarly, the people who are powerless, they have a lot of reason to be angry. So I mean, really, if you want to reduce the net amount of anger in society, I think achieving greater equality is one of the best ways to do it.
Yeah, no, I think displays of outrage are just mere symptoms of something deeper within the psyche. Powerlessness, like what you mentioned. And you know, in an OP conversation, we ran this nationally in Singapore with about 500 respondents all over Singapore. And there was consensus that the government is overly cautious when it comes to race and racial issues. We should not discuss this for fear of the negative consequences, but we should openly have a discussion and just talk it out. I think that's the main reason. It's the caution with which we are dealing with this, and then through a trauma-informed approach, because where does this caution come from? So dig a step deeper, right? It comes from, let's say, the race riots of Singapore, or the Indian bus riots, like just at the beginning of the millennium. So I think just tracing it back to such incidents where instead of tackling it head on and healing those divisions, we just swept them under the carpet and we did not heal them. Yeah, so the wounds are still fresh. It's still there, and we need to go through a period of healing. Another display of anger and outrage, the Danish cartoons of, you know, very insensitive displays of the Prophet Muhammad, And see, on one hand, the Danes believe that it's freedom of expression, right? I have the right to that. And then, but the Muslims feel that this is completely insensitive to my religion. Yeah, and then Charlie Hebdo magazine as well, and what happened in the beheading of the teacher who was So I think like in France as well, right? So I think like a lot of this is just issues we've not healed underneath, and it's because it's so messy and so difficult, and we don't have the tools to deal with them. Now there's something else that I've realized in my learning, right? And I think Unsu brought this up in a recent conversation that we had on trauma-informed community development. And I think Unsu shifted the game in that conversation by saying that we should not deal with this in a very mechanistic manner. Like, what are the tools we need to build? Rather, what is the toy box we need to build? So instead of a toolbox, we need to look at it from the perspective of a toy box. If you look at the metaphors underlying the language we have we've been discussing, right? It's like, how do I self-regulate? How do I co-regulate? How do I control anger? Like, all of these are from the mechanistic paradigm of the toolbox, the mechanic who is trying to fix anger. But I think a huge shift in our consciousness in society will come when we look at it from a very playful lens of like, how do we play with anger? How do we live with it, and how do we the same thing goes with the anger towards COVID-19 virus. Like, this is a war and a battle against COVID-19. Like, how do we now learn to playfully coexist with this new thing that we are curious about? Like how children, when they open up a toy box, they're so curious about everything. Like, how do I become curious about this little thing that's coming up within me that people describe as anger, but maybe what's underneath that? Can I explore that a bit more playfully with other people? So I think the underlying metaphors needs to be re-examined as well, because we're still living in this mechanistic control-based paradigm, and people in power, they just don't know how to accept that you need to let go of control. You don't have control over it. There is an art to navigating this.
Wow, Santosh, you have to talk about being angry about COVID. Because actually, I do want to bring this up as well, because this is one of the things I'm wrestling with right now. So, and I think it does kind of provide a good case study about all the issues we're talking about. So right now, I am in some sense angry, and I use it in a way that, of course, I'm not visibly or outraged or trying to be explosive about it, but I am angry at for now, let's point to one person, right? And because the reason is that I think this person is producing a lot of propaganda about COVID-19 and the vaccines. And, to me, it's like, so at the same time, you're right? Like there is no point maybe to be gained if I express that outrage at that person and, scream at him and say, oh, why are you doing this? Why are you saying such things? But at the same time, I find it very hard to find what is an appropriate way to be playful about this. And I actually do feel like, going back to what you said about institutional, in order to reduce the level of anger, we need to have better levels of equality, right? But sometimes it's not about equality, right? Like, people just have a different conception about a social issue. They're not necessarily of a higher class status, right? But they just see the problems very differently. And then, you got to deal with the validity of their information, of their knowledge. You have to deal with falsehoods, truths. It gets really murky. And that's where also people get very upset, because it's like, debasing my claims of knowledge and about what I believe is truthful, right? So I feel it's a really hard debacle. So in my case, I feel this is, in some sense, my advice. I've learned not to engage, because I just think that the sensible thing to do is project my anger in a more healthy manner, right? Perhaps I can not even talk about that person at all, right? Even though I'm talking about this person, but I'm not identifying him, I'm not trying to say anything specific about him. I'm just trying to say that, look, in general, I think this is what this person represents is a bigger social problem that we have, whether it's about to do with people understanding science, whether people are having too much access to conspiracy theories, and we need to work on ourselves to know how to spread the kind of information better, right, and have better institutional reform. Yeah.
Even breaking a spell on a show like this, that is your contribution.
Yeah. So yeah. Okay, should I kind of just bring it to a close? Yeah. So really, there's nothing much for me to say because I think we talk about quite a lot of stuff. So really, my conclusion really is because so there's this book. So it's actually a historical book. So in that sense, this book wasn't used as the basis for today's content. The book is by this author, Barbara Rosenwein. And in the book, right, essentially she goes through very chronologically how anger has been conceived and philosophized by different people in different ages. So the takeaway message here really is that if we look at anger, I think really it's a ineradicable part of human nature. I think we just got to recognize that. As Santosh, you talk about quite extensively today, it's just part of our nervous system. And even Darwin has kind of argued that it was crucial for us to survive because, perhaps through having this anger instinct, that's where you may actually fight harder, you may be more motivated to do certain things. Another researcher actually talks about that, Maisha Cherry. So she's a black activist and a professor. And she also actually in her talk about in neurological research, anger has been shown to be a very motivating factor for people to act. So I think we can't eradicate that essentially. But I think we just need to be careful because like today we've talked so much about the different facets and different ways we've coped with anger. So I think we just need to recognize that we can't just look at, say, if you're angry today, you're angry on the same day, that both your forms of anger are identical. You guys could be exhibiting in different manners. And regarding language, actually, so there's this thing about Eskimos, from what I understand, that is they have different words to describe different types of snow. So I think we lack that kind of vocabulary here also for anger. Like there clearly can be different ways that we express anger, and it can't be just one blanket term to describe the way that I'm angry today or tomorrow or the next day. And even the way that I've been angry, whether at myself, at my sister or at my mom or whoever, right? Like I even think that how I've displayed it has been very different and calibrated to what I feel is appropriate. So, but going back to Santosh, something that you brought on, which is I think we do need to teach children, that anger is more than just this one thing, that you can express it in different forms and it can be combined with different ways. So maybe by teaching children and teaching ourselves, all the ways that we can adapt and adopt this different shades of anger, we can come out much better for it. So yeah, and then from actually one particular author, Carol Tavis, who was the author for Mistakes Made by Others but Not by Me.
Mistakes were made but not by me.
Not by me, right? So she's a sociologist. So she essentially says that we need to be experts on our anger. We need to know what we are like when we are angry and how to transform that. So yeah. There was something about humor. Do you want me to talk about it actually?
Sure.
Or is there something I was going to say? So I want to role play a little bit. So this actually comes from self-defense and martial arts. So there's actually this really good advice for if you're in a possible altercation, right? And someone's being really angry at you, right? So Unsu, I just want you to shout at me and say, just say something like, "What are you looking at?"
Douglas, what's wrong with you? This was a terrible session, man.
Hey, that's a really nice shirt, man. Like, where do you get this from?
Oh.
Yeah. Well, Santosh, I just don't think you can roleplay the angry person. But imagine if someone said to you, right, like, "Hey, why are you looking at my girl?" Right? And then, you could respond with like, "Oh, sorry, is that Mary? I think she's my friend from high school," something like that. So, this is like one of the best ways, right, that you don't have to defend yourself physically and, of course, reciprocate anger with anger, but just diffuse the situation with humor. And I think also going back to some of the things we talk about that have happened in the public sphere, perhaps if we come up with films or with popular media, right, to make fun of the situation, expose the absurdities, perhaps we can also bring people to a better place to also understand, hey, yes, you can be angry about this, but let's try to move forward in a positive manner to bring about social change, because we still want that. But in that sense, we are exposing the absurdities and also laughing at ourselves. Yes, we are angry. We should recognize that. like say climate change, but we want to go forward and not constantly, behave in a vindicative manner. So yeah, any closing?
But not be insensitive to the needs of some people. Sometimes we can use humor, like what
Yeah,
the
it
Europeans
needs to be
use.
really appropriate.
And it needs to be appropriate humor and not insensitive humor, which can go the other way.
Yeah, no, I definitely love humor as an antidote to the worst sort of expressions of anger. So Pema Chodron, again, what I love about her is she does have a sense of humor, and she talks about an episode where she kind of lost it with her 5-year-old granddaughter. And then she said, she would tell the grandma, but please don't tell anyone grandma lost it because I'm supposed to be Pema Chodron, like this person who never loses it. And then she also says, like, her motivation for working with anger is that she doesn't want to have this spiritual practice her whole life, and then at the end of her life she may be in a hospital, bedridden, and then a nurse comes in that just knows how to push her buttons, and at the end of her life she just loses it at the nurse, right? So she tells she is grateful for all the opportunities in her life to work with anger because she does want to get better and better at it. So I'll end with an inside joke for Singaporeans. I agree with you that we should definitely have a lot of different words for anger, more nuanced views of anger, but perhaps Singaporeans should avoid using umbrage to refer to anger.
Oh, great reference point. Great one. Yeah. All right. And so that comes to a close for our chat today.